what we will plan to do today is go through the exam a little bit, and I'm not just going to give you the answers. I mean, once I get everything finished up grading, you'll see all the answers, but at least a few of the problems that are a little bit interesting that we can talk about a little bit, go through those a little bit, and then also go through the group activities from Wednesday, and also the quiz and any of the homework questions with the analogical arguments. The group activities look pretty good overall. Didn't have any large or systematic concerns from what I was seeing from the group activities, but we'll go over all of those problems, and then we can talk about the quiz that was due today, and we can talk about the homework assignments too. So that's the goal. We're going to try something a little bit new. I did a trial run at the beginning, and it looked like it was working okay. I'm going to try to share with you my screen. So we'll start with the analogy stuff, and then we'll end the day with the going over the exam, and there won't be any new material covered. So we'll start causal arguments. We'll start those just next week. So let's go through, unless anyone has any initial starting questions or anything. I was thinking we just start by going through the group activities. No questions? All right. Let's start by just going through them. So, whiteboard up. So the first question, the first problem on the group activities: attacking your next door neighbors and killing them is immoral. War also involves attacking next door neighbors and killing them. Thus, war is immoral. All right. First step: what are the analogs? What two things are getting compared? In this case, it's attacking your next door neighbor and killing them. And that's getting compared and contrasted with war. Step one. Okay, how are these two things related? Well, both of them involve violence. Right? So violence is involved in both. Both involve death. And both, I suppose, deaths of people who are near you in some vague sense of the term. What are the dissimilarities? And in this case, I think the dissimilarities are a bit more pronounced. So here's one. The scale of the violence is very different. The sense of near is very different. But I actually don't think either of these are especially relevant dissimilarities. So what are some perhaps more relevant dissimilarities? Well, here's one. It is never legal for you to attack and kill your neighbor. There is no scenario where that is actually a legal behavior. Now, it would be legal to defend yourself from an attack by your neighbor, but that's not attacking the neighbor. Actually, attacking the neighbor is never actually itself a legal act, whereas there are scenarios where war is legal. Especially in cases of self-defense. If you've been attacked by some foreign power, you're allowed to defend yourself. That seems like a particularly relevant difference because that pertains to the actual moral question. So this is probably a pretty bad analogy. And this issue directly pertains to whether or not war is moral. By and large, all the answers I was seeing in this particular problem looked pretty good. Anyone have any question or anything they want to go over on this first question? All right. Let's move on to the second one. Second one was supposed to be a really clear example of a time when you just don't have enough information. Unless you happen to remember this incident from the early 2010s when I was following sports more carefully. I don't know that you would actually have enough information that you would remember this case in enough detail to actually know if this is a good or bad analogy. So let's go over an example of a problem that looks like that and how we would address such a problem. So step one is still the same. You can identify the analogs. Right? What's being compared? USC's infractions and penalty. And those are being contrasted or compared with other past instances of infractions and penalties. And my guess is, again, for the overwhelming majority of you, you're not going to remember this case, so you're actually not going to know what the relevant similarities or differences are. You don't know what USC did, and the argument doesn't say, and you don't know what was done in the other cases. So in this case, for my guess is most of you, your answer ultimately is I need more information. What information would be helpful? Well, you'd need to know what USC actually did and what penalty they received. You'd need to know what these other past infractions were. A few people on the group assignments brought up, but I thought it was a really good point. You'd need to know, have the NCAA bylaws changed? Indeed, that's a very pertinent information. If rules change, you could expect perhaps different penalties for same actions as a result of the change. Okay? So these are all the things you would need to know. Why would you need to know them? Because they directly pertain to whether or not the USC's punishment was actually fair. And in just point of fact, in terms of what actually happened in this case, in fact, USC probably got off light. The cases that the president was actually comparing their actions to weren't really comparable, and actually USC's violations were way more egregious, and they actually probably deserved a more serious penalty. Right? But if you don't know any of that, right, what you would need to do is articulate what you would need to know. And again, people did a pretty good job with this question. And everyone gave some, more or less, I think, some variant of the answer. But again, let's just pause for a second. Anyone have any questions on that problem? Anything anyone would like to go over with that one? All right. The next two, I got a lot of different answers, and that was actually fine. There's actually are a couple different answers people can give. Everyone gave basically the same answers for the first two questions. But for the second two, I actually did see some different answers. So let's go over those now. All right. So the CEO had an affair and lied about it to her family for years. So she's willing to lie about such important domestic matters. What reason do we have to believe that she refrained from lying to shareholders? All right. So first, what's being compared? The CEO's conduct in private is being versus her conduct in public. Those are our analogs. Right. How are these two things similar? And how you answer this question, I think how you understand the similarities really depend on what kind of conclusion you're going to come to. So here are the two different kinds of answers we saw, and I'll show you both of them. Here's one answer I got. Similarities. Some people argued how you act in private is pretty similar to how you act in public. Particularly about important things. Some people made that argument. How are they different? Well, one's private, one's public. If you sort of framed it in this way, and people who framed it in this way, the conclusion they came to come to is that this was a good analogy. Right? Your parents or your family tend to be more important to you than faceless shareholders. So if you lie to one, you lie to the other. And this answer, this conclusion makes sense based on the similarities and the way people sort of, how people sort of characterize the similarities. So if you gave some variant of this answer, that's fine. But I also saw a very different set of answers from people. Some people said, what are the similarities in this case? Well, the same person is involved. But what are the differences? What are the dissimilarities? Right? Who you are in public is not necessarily who you are in private. People who took this approach are suggesting that there's a way bigger difference between how people act when they're sort of in private versus how they act when in public, and especially in business, right? Who you are at work, is that who you are at home? And many people thought, actually, no, you're very different people in those two places. If this is the way you frame the problem, then the conclusion you should have come to is that the argument is that this is a bad analogy. And other differences we could point here to even strengthen this: the consequences of lying in private to your family are very different from the consequences of lying to shareholders. You can go to jail if you lie to your shareholders. So that's actually a crime. Whereas adultery, while bad for domestic bliss, is not indeed a crime. Either answer is actually fine. I think there's a compelling case to be made in either direction. So I gave people full points for both of them. I'm fine with sort of either answer. Any questions about that one? All right, let's do the last one. Again, I saw a couple different answers in this case. Actually, I probably saw more answers for this problem than for any of the other problems. And two of the three answers probably work reasonably well. One didn't really work very well. So, okay, we got to animal testing, right? We're testing out, trying to figure out what the effects are of low zero gravity environments on animal life and bone density, and the study discovered that it had very poor results for the animals, and therefore that's likely to have very poor results in human beings as well. All right, so what are the analogs? Non-human animals, a variety of them, versus humans. The two answers that I saw that I think work reasonably well, some people argued this was a good analogy. Other people said they needed more information. And I think you could plausibly say either in this case. I thought either made a certain sort of sense. So I'll start with the needing more information first. If you felt you needed more information, what more information would you need? In particular, you need to know precisely what animals it is. And in particular, what do you need to know? You need to know, were the animals tested on? Do they form, or do their bones attain the density in the same way that human bones do? And if you took this track for the problem, it's this last point that's the especially important one. It's not just how do these animals compare to human beings in general? That's not necessarily relevant. What's relevant is how do they respond, how do they compare with respect to bone density in particular? That's what we're actually talking about. Other similarities or other commonalities or discommonalities with the animals don't really matter, right? Because all we're concerned with is them as a comparison group for bone density. All right, and why would you need to know this? Because if these animals acquire their bone density in a very different way, it's not a good analogy. One thing to note here, a couple people, not many, but I've suggested that this made the argument outright bad, and it doesn't do that. We don't know what the animals were. We don't know. Not knowing isn't enough to say that it's actually that there are in fact disanalogies. To say that it would be a bad analogy, you would have to say that there are in fact disanalogies and say precisely what they are. And in this case, I just don't think you have enough information to sort of warrant that conclusion. You should just say we would need more information to know if this is a good or bad analogy. So this answer works. This answer is fine. I probably would say it's not the best answer, but it works. It's fine. Its logic is sound. A better answer, I think, so let's go that way. I think the better answer in this case is that this is just outright a good analogy. And let's talk about why I prefer good analogy to need more information in this case. So what are the similarities? Well, okay, animals, a wide variety of animals are likely that at least some of them are like humans. Also, other similarities in this case, all animals, including humans, live on Earth currently. And are exposed to Earth's normal level of gravity. This test isn't being carried out in any Martian spiders or whatever. Like, not that there are such things, right? But if there were Martian spiders, if you were testing it on them, yeah, we might well suspect that there's important differences. But in this case, all of these are Earth animals that are sort of exposed to Earth's normal gravitational field. How are they different? Differences? Well, not the animals aren't humans. All right. Is that difference relevant? Sure, that's indeed an important difference, and it could lead to problems. But remember, we're dealing with inductive arguments here. In inductive arguments, the conclusion you're reaching is never a certain one. The question is, do I have good reason to believe the conclusion? And in this case, I just think you kind of do, just on the basis of what you've been presented with. have reason to think that, yeah, there's at the very least reason to be concerned that low gravity is dangerous for humans, regardless of what animals were actually tested on. And that's all you need for a good inductive argument. You don't need to know that the conclusion is certain. You just need to think that it's likely or that it's reasonable to believe it. And in this case, whatever animals were tested on, I think this would indeed give us some good reason to be reticent about what the effects of long-term low-gravity environments would have on human beings. So again, I think the I need more information answer, it works. I would have given it full points. I think this answer is a little bit better just because the standard of proof for these inductive arguments isn't I know for sure. It's that there's pretty good reason to believe that the conclusion is true based on the analogy. But again, I would and did give full points to both answers. All right. So that's going through the group activities from last class period. Does anyone have any questions about that, especially that last one? The last one was probably the trickiest, I think. How are people feeling about the analogies in general? Like I said, the ones that I graded, it looked like people were doing a reasonably good job. Would anyone like to go over things a little bit more with these analogies? People want to go over the quiz or go over the homework? I don't want to bore you all if you're all feeling confident enough, but I also don't want to not go over stuff people would like to discuss. So are we good with analogies? Would anyone like to do a little bit more discussion on them? All right, great. Then let us go on to the exam. I'm going to have to leave the exam up for a while, and again, I'm not going to be able to see it if you have questions, so everyone should have the ability to unmute yourself. If while we're going over the exam, you do have any questions, probably just unmute yourself and ask them. That'll probably be the easiest way, because I just won't be able to actually see it. And again, let's hope this is actually going to work this time again. All right. Hopefully everyone is in fact seeing a version of the exam on Canvas. If not, let me know. But yeah, hopefully that is indeed what everyone is seeing. So let's just go through these. We'll go through them pretty quickly. I'm not going to focus so much on just what the right or wrong answers are, because you'll see those when I actually get everything graded. I just want to talk about any of the ones that are perhaps a little bit interesting. So is it possible for an argument to be sound but not valid? Nope, that's the opposite. It's possible for an argument to be valid but not sound. What characterizes a good inductive argument? Good inductive arguments are strong. And this is, on the one hand, just kind of a terminological point, but it does have some importance. If you say on an exam or a quiz or one of these group activities that an inductive argument is valid, do I know what you mean? Probably. I probably know what you mean. But valid does indeed have a very specific technical definition, right? It means, and it sort of relates to that last problem we were just talking about. If you're saying that an argument is valid, you're saying that the conclusion follows with some kind of certainty. And that's a really high, a really strong standard. It can indeed matter in some cases if that high standard is actually the one that's justified. I've got a question here. Is it possible to unhide the exam in Canvas to see what people put in? Actually, I do actually see it. Yeah, I can do that real fast. Give me 1 second. Let me turn this down so I don't but yeah, I should be able to do that. Give me just 1 second, and I'll hide it again because I don't want you to sort of see the scores while I'm in the middle of working on them. But I can at the very least open it up so you can see your answers now. So let's see there. All right. All right, so yeah, you should now be able to actually go in and look at what you in fact submitted on the exam. Hope that is helpful. So let's go back to the sharing. Yeah, all right. So explain the difference between an inductive and deductive. I basically just sort of talked through it. Deductive arguments, conclusion follows with certainty. inductive conclusion just follows with some degree of likelihood. It's a lower standard, and that really does matter in terms of how we sort of going to evaluate some of these questions. We sort of need to hold the inductive arguments to a lower standard than we hold the inductive one, than we held the deductive ones to. How are the fallacies of illusory support different from the fallacies of minimal support? Minimal support premises give you some reason to believe that the conclusion is true. Illusory support, they don't really give any reason to believe that the conclusion is true. Probative ones, what are the probative arguments? How do they differ from the statistical ones? Good probative inductive arguments supply good reasons to believe that the conclusion is true, though those reasons could be overturned if more evidence is discovered. That is correct. What we're going to look at for the next couple weeks are really just probative ones. Near the end of the semester, we'll start looking at a few different kinds of statistical inductive arguments, particularly in inductive generalizations and what I call statistical syllogisms. So next task, figuring out if the argument is deductive or inductive, specifying which is which. So every windstorm in this area comes from the north. I see a big cloud of dust in the distance coming from the north right now, thus the windstorm is about to hit us. That is an inductive argument. B is the deductive one. Right? Why? It has to do with this whenever. The whenever is sort of an if-then statement, right? So if I see a big cloud coming from the north, then there will be a windstorm. If we assume that rule is correct, there's no possibility that the windstorm won't hit. The windstorm has to hit on the assumption that that is a correct rule. But that's not the case in this case. In this case, we're not given the same kind of rule. Every time a windstorm comes, every time there's a windstorm, it comes from the north. Something is coming from the north, but it doesn't have to be a windstorm. It could be something else. Right? There's no rule that's supposed to apply universally or in every case, whereas in B, there's a rule that's supposed to apply universally or in every case. So that's the difference. That's why the one is inductive, why the other is deductive. All right. Get to our immediate categorical inferences. I'll go through these fast because there's not much point in going over them in much detail. So some human beings are mortal. All human beings are mortal. What's that relationship? Some, all, that's a relationship of subalternation, right? But it's not a valid one. It's invalid. You can go from the universal to the particular, but you can't go from the particular to the universal with subalternation. Some human beings are not reptiles. Therefore, it is not the case that some human beings are reptiles. We've got the two particulars. The some are not, the some are. Those are subcontraries. Subcontraries can, but don't have to, both be true, but they can't both be false. So the fact that one of them is true, it doesn't necessitate that the other one is true or false. So again, that's invalid. And note that's true in this case, even though indeed it is true that some human beings are not reptiles, right? The conclusion is true, but the reasoning that gets us to that conclusion isn't reliable reasoning, and we could come up with counterexamples that have the exact same logical form, but where the conclusion is not true. Is it sound or unsound? Okay, it's unsound. You know that one because it's an invalid argument. It's unsound. Right. It is not the case that some humans are piano players. Therefore, no humans are piano players. So we've got some humans are. We've got no humans are. Those are contradictories. What's the rule with contradictories? They have to have opposite truth values. So one has to be true, the other has to be false. And that's what we see in this case. One is false, the other is true. So it is indeed a valid argument. Is it a sound argument, though? Well, is it true that it is not the case that some human beings are piano players? And I'd say no. Some human beings indeed can play the piano. So there's a false premise. It's valid, so it could be sound, but because of the false premise, it is unsound. Doing okay so far? Any questions? I'll just pop out for a second. Doing okay so far? Any questions, anything at this point? All right, great. I know this isn't the most exciting of days, so sorry about that. But it is, some of the things from this exam are going to carry over, so it's going to be valuable to go over them. And also, I'm not going to have time to really write any comments on the exam. You're just going to get a score. So this is sort of in lieu of me writing comments on your exam if you get something wrong. Right. Categorical syllogisms. All right, this first step is probably the most important, just because the way that I had to give you these sort of Venn diagrams as a multiple choice, so we had to mean the same thing by our S's, our P's, and our M's. The most important thing here is that you start with the conclusion. So some Menidians are Padachians, so some S is P. All right, we use that to fill in the rest. So the first premise, all M, the one that doesn't appear in the conclusion, is P. Some Snorgels, again, that's the one that doesn't appear in the conclusion, so it's got to be RM, is a Menician, that's the S in the conclusion. Okay? And this is the reason why this step matters. On the one hand, this is just mere convention, but what matters about this is we have to sort of almost agree on the convention so that you can read my Venn diagrams. We have to mean the same thing by S, P, and M, and so following this convention allows us to mean the same thing by S, P, and M. So in this particular case, the correct Venn diagram was indeed B. This was the right answer. If anyone would like, I'm not going to go over and drawing the Venn diagram now, but if anyone still has questions about Venn diagrams or would like to go over precisely why this is the case, let me know. We can either do it during office hours or during some other time. But the correct Venn diagram for an argument with this form is indeed B. Is the conclusion already present? So the conclusion is some S is P. Do I see some S is P in the Venn diagram? I do. And which S is P? That one, the X. So I do indeed see my conclusion present. So the argument is valid. All right, now here's the trick, or here's the tricky part. Is the argument sound or unsound based on what we know? So it's valid. That means it could be sound, right? What do you need for soundness? You need to be a valid argument and you need to have true premises. So we satisfy the first condition. We've got a valid argument. Are these premises true? All Snorgels are Padachians. Some Snorgels are Menicians. Are those actually, in fact, true premises? We don't know. We have no idea what Snorgels, Padachians, or Menicians are. So we don't know if they actually have the relationship that the premises are saying they are. So in this case, it is indeterminate whether or not the argument is valid or not. Oh, sorry, whether or not the argument is sound or not. The soundness is indeterminate. You know it's valid, so it could be sound, but you just don't know if those premises are true or false. So you don't have enough information to determine if the argument is actually sound. You can't conclude that it's unsound, though, because you don't know what those things are. It could well be the case that Snorgels, Padachians, and whatever the other one was, that those things really do stand in the relationship that the premises say. You just don't know. To say sound, unsound, you would have to say that you actually know for sure that it's unsound. Similarly with sound. All right, similar situation in this case, we got to start with the conclusion. So if we start from the conclusion, what we end up with is no S is P. As a premise, no P is M. Notice at this time that the S, the P's, and the M's, they don't stand for the same classes that they did in the previous problem, and that's fine. That's, the variables, they can stand for anything. Right? What matters is that we're sort of following the right convention, and in this case, S is the Menicians, P has to be the Snorgels because we started with our conclusion, so it's no P is M, and some M is P. Oh, sorry, some M is S. Right? Because Menicians are the S, the subject term of the conclusion. All right, and if you got this one again, then it's just a question of figuring out what the right Venn diagram is. In this case, the correct Venn diagram was D. That was actually the right one. The question is now, do I see what I would need to see for the conclusion to actually be true? Do I see already in my Venn diagram no SSP? What would no SSP have to look like? It would have to look like these two regions in the Venn diagram being shaded in, and they're not shaded in. Right? It would have to look like this one. What I did in B, I just actually diagrammed the conclusion in addition to the two premises. So it would look like those red marks. I don't see that in D, so I've got an invalid argument. All right. And again, here now, Do I know if it's sound or unsound? Well, I still don't know if the premises are true or false. I still don't know what these Snorgels, Predachians, and Venetians actually are. But this time it doesn't matter. An invalid argument has to be unsound. So I can know unsoundness simply on the basis of that in this case. Right? And that was sort of the test. The point of those two questions was to sort of test and see how well do you actually sort of really know what soundness means and how it relates to validity and truth. So again, I just want to pause for a second. Any questions on either of those? Also make sure I'm not missing anything on the chat. All right, great. Keep going. Conditionals, again, I'm not going to go over these in sort of great details because we'll just go through the answers real fast. So if you don't need any groceries, then going to the store is a waste of time, but you do need groceries. All right. The trick in this problem is that affirming the antecedent, because we're talking about the antecedent, right? So we're talking about the if part, the needing groceries. Is this affirming it or denying it? It's not a negative statement. It's not a statement that's saying that anything isn't true. But actually, the antecedent was saying that something isn't true. So the antecedent was saying you don't need groceries. This is saying you do need groceries, so that's going to be denying the antecedent. That was the trick in this problem. It is dealing with the antecedent, but it's actually denying it even though it doesn't look like it. And denying the antecedent is just not a valid argument form. That's invalid. Look at those crows over there in the distance. If crows are circling off in the distance, then I assure you that someone has died. I guess someone has died then. So the conclusion in this case would be the last sentence. So crows in the distance, crows in the distance. Same thing is being said. The premise is affirming the antecedent. So in this case, this is affirming the antecedent, and that is a valid argument form. Necessary and sufficient conditions. So assume that I am a highly jumpy person, that I scream every time I get poked in the side. Okay, so based on that assumption, is poking me in the side a necessary condition for me to scream or a sufficient condition? Both, neither. Here's how you sort of would talk your way through it. Okay. If I get poked in the side, will I always scream? And in this case, based on the assumption, the answer is yes. So we know it's sufficient, right? Could it be necessary? Maybe because it could be both necessary and sufficient. That's a possibility too. Is it also necessary? Well, okay. Every time I scream, do I get poked in the side? And that seems unlikely. I could scream for any number of reasons besides getting poked in the side. So it's not necessary. It is sufficient, so it can't be either of the other two. Is Thomas being older than Fred a necessary condition for Fred to be younger than Thomas, or a sufficient condition, or both or neither? Again, let's do the same reasoning, right? Every time, and it's weird to say every time, right? But go with it. Every time Thomas is older than Fred, is it true that Fred will be younger than Thomas? Yes, every single time. So it's a sufficient condition. Could it also be necessary? Well, let's check. Will Fred ever be younger than Thomas without Thomas being older than Fred? No. They sort of mutually entail one another. So both are true. It's both necessary and sufficient in this case. These are sort of a mutual entailment. One implies the other, and the other implies the one. Right? They only will ever happen if they happen together. They won't happen in any other condition. And so that's why this one was both necessary and sufficient. Right. And that's the end of the inductive portion of the exam. So before we move to any of the fallacies, which is the rest of the exam, any last questions there? All right. So let's go through the fallacies real fast. What fallacy does this argument commit? Before he died, the poet Allen Ginsberg argued in favor of legalizing pornography. But Ginsberg and his argument are both trash. He was a drug-abusing hippie, hardly someone worth taking seriously. This is some kind of ad hominem. In this case, this seems pretty clearly to be an abusive ad hominem. Why? And in this case, I can't, off the top of my head at least, I can't think of any fallacy that really works besides this one. The reason why this is the only fallacy that seems to work is because Ginsberg himself is being attacked, not his argument. And the only fallacy that really has that structure are the ad hominems, either the circumstantial or the abusive. Why is this one abusive? Because we seem to be sort of insulting Ginsberg rather than just dismissing him. That's the difference between the abusive. That's a sense in which it's abusive. It's sort of insulting. We also have, okay, so number two then, does this commit the problematic premise fallacy? Again, I would say yes, this does commit it. Why? Because pacifists are unlikely to agree. that you are morally allowed to attack someone, to engage in a preemptive strike. Right. And remember, that's what's going on with problematic premise. Is the audience that the argument is addressed to likely to find any of the premises as problematic, if not more, than the conclusion? And in this case, so we have someone speak defending the death penalty. They're doing it before pacifists. A key part of this argument is this premise that you're allowed to attack someone sort of preemptively, allowed to attack someone before they attack you. But a pacifist is unlikely to agree with that. A pacifist is unlikely to think you're allowed to attack anyone. So just asserting that principle is unlikely to move a pacifist. You would have to also justify that principle if you're going to avoid the problematic premise fallacy. No one has ever definitively proved that the claims of astrology are necessarily false. As a result, if you are wise, you'll put your trust in the astrologers and their horoscopes. This one pretty clearly seems to be absence of evidence. The fact that astrology hasn't been definitively disproven doesn't give you any reason to believe that it's actually true. All right, here you're tasked with figuring out why the first of these arguments commits both hasty generalization and anecdotal, but the second only commits hasty generalization. And the difference between the two is how immediate and vivid the person's experience of that leads them to their generalization is. In the case of A, I'm relying on my own bad experiences. B relies on this random selection of people, random selection of 3 people. I'm way more likely to treat my own experiences as important than the experience of 3 random people that I don't know. Near the end of the semester, we'll talk about this. This is sort of a cognitive bias people have. People have a tendency to just privilege their own experiences too much, and that's the difference in this case, right? An opinion, a poll of 3 people, very few people are likely to take that seriously, at least if you actually sort of looked into the details and saw that it was a poll of just 3 people. You would sort of naturally suspect that that's not enough cases. Whereas your own one experience, that's even less than three random people, right? But yet you probably are going to be way more likely to avoid the store on the basis of your own experiences than you are of experiences had by other people. And that's why we distinguish anecdotal evidence sometimes from hasty generalization. Usually anecdotal evidence is way more persuasive or compelling to people than hasty generalizations are. And that one will be a little bit important when we go to statistical syllogisms too. So again, I'll just pause for a second. Any questions about that distinction? All right. Well, yeah, when we go to inductive generalizations later in the semester, we'll look at some similar point. We'll look at a similar point. All right. We're getting near the end. So thanks for putting up with not a super interesting day. So question, does this argument commit the straw person fallacy? What is the straw person fallacy? It's where you misrepresent someone's beliefs to make the argument easier to refute. Right. So here we have someone who is strongly opposed to prayer in school setting. I don't believe that religion should have any place in any governmental context. Right. Person B's response, this is where the straw person would be. Are you also opposed to swearing on the Bible in courts? Courts are government buildings too, you know. It seems silly to be bothered by something as common as religious stuff in public governmental settings. Also, note this is an analogical argument, just sort of as an aside. This actually is an analogical argument. Person B is comparing praying in school to swearing on the Bible in courts, right? And saying that they're both similar in that both are religion in governmental contexts. And in this case, I would say I don't think person B is committing the straw person fallacy. And it's because person A specified just governmental context in general, and court is indeed a governmental context. in that case, we don't, it doesn't seem to me like person A is being misrepresented at all. Person A's position seems as if it's being sort of adequately taken up. Now, whether or not it's a good analogy, right, that's an entirely different question. Just because you avoid committing the straw person fallacy doesn't mean you've made a good argument. There's at least reasons to be a little bit suspicious of the analogy. There seem to be relevant differences between what's happening in schools and what happens in the courtroom, perhaps. But that's sort of a separate issue, right? Like first hurdle you almost have to jump over. You have to not commit the straw person fallacy. Then we can analyze your analogy and see if that's a good or bad analogy. But if you had committed straw person fallacy, the argument would have been bad, absolutely. So definitely not straw person, maybe not a good argument, but that's not what you were asked to evaluate here. All you were asked to evaluate here was, has straw person in particular been committed? Last one, what fallacy has been committed here? There's been a large push lately to protect certain rivers and waterways from various kinds of pollutants that harm the local fish population, like salmon. However, if you ask me, all these efforts are a waste of time. Whatever we do, we'll never be able to ensure that human activities have no impact on local fish populations. Again, the pretty obvious fallacy in this case to me seems like this is an example of a relevant standard. The purpose of environmental protections aren't to ensure that human actions have no negative impact, but to mitigate and lessen the harm caused by human impact. Trying to suggest that these environmental regulations would have to ensure that no impact occurs, that's just too high of a standard. It's not what any of these environmental protection proposals are intended to actually accomplish. So it's not super relevant. Last one, one last one to go. Have we committed the begging the question fallacy here? I am completely, so what is begging the question fallacy? Let's remind ourselves of that one real quickly. Begging the question is where the conclusion and the premises basically just say the exact same thing. So you don't make any real progress. You just sort of repeat the premise, perhaps worded in a different way in the conclusion. Does this following argument commit the begging the question fallacy? Explain why it does or does not. This one's very close. That's why it's the last of the problems. This is probably the trickiest of these fallacy questions. So I am completely convinced that smoking causes cancer. Why? Because the smoke from cigarettes is carcinogenic, or is a carcinogen. Okay. What does it mean? What does it mean for something to be a carcinogen? Something that causes cancer. Okay. That's what it means to be a carcinogen. I'm not spelling that word right. So that's just what the word means. So, okay, what is the conclusion actually saying? Smoking causes cancer because the smoke from smoking causes cancer. I think in this case, we just avoid begging the question. Though it is close. And it's because of this talk of the smoke. Right, the smoke is in the premise, so why believe that smoking causes cancer? Because the smoke causes cancer. The smoke produced by smoking causes cancer. That is indeed smoking, the activity of just, actually, you can tell I'm not a smoker if I'm holding a cigarette, I think. But the act of smoking itself, right, that causes cancer because the smoke produced by that act causes cancer. The premise and conclusion seem to be just different enough. We've learned that the specific thing that's dangerous about the smoking as the activity is the smoke that activity produces. That is new. That is something a little bit different. So I think we just barely avoid begging the question in this case. All right. So thank you all. I think we're at the end of our class period today. So thank you all. I know this was not, by any stretch of the imagination, the most interesting class period we've had. So I appreciate your forbearance for it. Again, going through the exam is going to stand in for me writing comments on the exams. Everything is just taking a lot longer as a result of the online shift. So I'm going to have to try to get through the exams pretty quickly over the weekend. I will hopefully have them done for Monday for everyone, so you'll be able to see precisely how well you did. And so going through the exam, have this be sort of in lieu of me writing comments, But if you do end up with additional questions about why I graded particular problems on your exam the way that I did, feel free to come talk with me even during office hours or email. I am going to move right into my office hours, so I'll just leave this room open. People are free to leave and go at this point, but if anyone would like to come to my office hours, just stick around, and we can go over anything you'd like to go over. Thank you all very much. Have a good weekend.